Okay, so last time we went through the revolution and killed off Napoleon, and that brings us to the period after the revolution. So, from the perspective of the French aristocracy and many of the elite throughout Europe, the French Revolution was like a disease, and they need to make sure that that disease is contained, doesn't break out ever again. Revolution illustrated was the power of mass politics, especially a mass political movement that was motivated by an emotional force like nationalism. And so in France, there are going to continue to be politicians that believe that they can harness nationalism and use it to channel mass political movements to their own advantage. And so, from the perspective of the literate French classes, they're going to see nationalism as a key to producing the reforms in the political system that they want. So, kind of looking at the system in France at this point, you have the restoration of the monarchy. So, the brother of Louis XVI, Louis XVIII, is now the king again. And he does not admit that he's not an absolute monarch. He does guarantee French rights and what was known as the Constitutional Charter. The Constitutional Charter said that the French monarch would respect many of the rights gained under Napoleon and property rights, that kind of thing. But by calling it a charter and not a constitution, the French monarch is saying, I can just get rid of this whenever I want to. And so the liberals in France then are going to want a more concrete reform than what that entails. And so you have Louis XVIII, who was in many ways reactionary, but was much more cautious after Napoleon returned in the Battle of Waterloo. And it's his brother, Charles X, who brings on the next revolution in France. And so Charles X wasn't just conservative, which was the ideology of many of the members of the Concert of Europe. Leaders of the concert like Metternich would fall into that category of conservative. Charles X wasn't just conservative, he was reactionary. He wanted to go back to an earlier time. He wanted to definitely be seen as an absolute monarch. And so from his perspective, any privilege that he happened to grant could easily be taken away. He makes the political error of taking away those privileges at the same time that he was trying to use the army to expand into Algeria. And so while the army is away, he tries to limit the right to vote in France. There were elections in 1830. Those elections did not go to Charles X's taste. He tries to, he dissolved the legislature and then instituted changes that limited the right to vote to the very, very rich. In order to get a more conservative return. And that set off an uprising. He was overthrown, and Louis Philippe became the next king. So this is a very conservative revolution in France. What it really does is it confirms the constitutional charter that the French kings had signed after the defeat of Napoleon. But I think more importantly, it shows once again that power of mass politics. There's no going back. The best that the conservatives could do is try to channel these forces in a direction that would help their own policies. But to try to undo them was likely to lead to this kind of backlash. And so the 1830 revolution sets off other revolutions in Europe because the hope was that the French once again would champion revolutionary causes, but they're not going to do that this time. And so you have the 1830 revolution. Louis Philippe is the more liberal choice, but we go from what was essentially a limited monarchy to a slightly more limited monarchy. The big changes come in 1848. So by 1848, as we'll see, France has begun to industrialize. And industrialization has clustered the poor in cities, and the poor people are aware of shared suffering. You have low wages and unsafe conditions, and then on top of that, there's a series of crop failures that once again causes prices to spike. In 1848, this is this working class, middle class type of revolution where the middle class wants political reforms and the working class is more worried about economic reforms. is going to put the two at odds. And so this is another illustration of a revolution where at first everybody's on the same page. They get rid of Louis Philippe, but then once it gets going, there are disagreements between the groups, and those disagreements are going to cause in some way the revolution to fall apart. This is the revolution where we see the first use of the barricades, the throwing of furniture in the streets, piling up things and blocking streets so that armies can't get through. And so in 1848, what happens in France is France is declared a republic. And it looks like France is going in an extremely liberal, maybe even radical direction, because the Republic declares that it's going to institute Louis Blanc's socialist national workshop policy, which basically gave the workers control of the factories. And so that it was socialist in that you didn't have an entrepreneur who was running the show, and so there's no business class in charge. And so that doesn't work very well. And the workers are going to accuse the government of not giving enough time. The government is going to accuse the workers of being inefficient in the national workshop setup. And so the government will announce that the workshops are being closed down. When that happens, the workers are going to rise up and revolt. And so this is that moment of truth for the middle class. Who are they going to side with? Well, they side with the established military elite in this case, and that alliance is going to put down what were known as the June Days, these days of uprising in Paris. One of the French generals solved the problem of barricades by pointing his cannon directly at them and just obliterating them along with the houses around the barricades. So nevertheless, the Republic, which is the Second Republic, is maintained. And so it looks like this is closer to the 1789 revolution than it was to that 1830 revolution. Okay, so I mentioned the national workshops. The Republic that is formed, as we'll see, is fragile, though. One of the problems with French republics generally is that they typically were formed only because the people who didn't want a republic couldn't align themselves. And that was very much the case here. There were people who opposed the republic and wanted some kind of Bonapartist government, a dictatorship, some kind of military dictatorship. There were people who favored a restoration of the Orleans dynasty of Louis Philippe, and there were people who favored the Bourbon dynasty of Charles X, and there were people who favored something else. But luckily for the republic, they couldn't come together, at least in the first 2 years. And so the 1848 revolution can be seen as a greater success in France in a lot of ways than that earlier revolution. Okay, so I mentioned France's industrialization, so let's take a step back and look at what happens and what's going on in that era. And so the 19th century is the period of Romanticism in France and across Europe. So you have this view that nature is powerful and tempestuous and beautiful, but uncontrollable. And so there's that kind of emotional part of it. And so as France industrializes, there is this greater literate public that is influenced by the ideals of Romanticism in France as in other places. Now, if we go to industrialization, industrialization in France differs from other states in Europe. It differs from British industrialization in that it is state-sponsored to a much greater degree. So when states try to catch up, what is often going to happen is that the government is going to front a lot of the investment costs because there just isn't the capital in the country to industrialize quickly otherwise. And you want to be able to catch up to the British in this case as fast as possible. So with government sponsorship of railroads and certain types of manufacturing, that's more possible. So that in a way is in keeping with the French use of mercantilism early on. Now, compared to virtually every other part of the West that industrializes, France's industrialization is more gradual and less disruptive. And so you can see the map in the bottom left-hand corner of the steam engines, and that even by 1865, the rural parts of France, the parts of France that would have been least urbanized prior to industrialization, still haven't industrialized very much. And so life in those areas wasn't going to change during the industrial period. It really didn't change for many of those areas until after World War II. Even after World War II, there was, people reference a peasant class in France. So that means that compared to the British and compared to the Prussians or the Americans, French industrialization had a less disruptive effect on the social system. So part of the reason that things were a little bit smoother in France is that the Republic elects as its president Napoleon III, who becomes one of these 19th century popular dictators. And so Napoleon III, as a popular dictator, saw it as his job to ensure the prosperity of France. So he's an astute guy. He understands that if most of the French people have jobs, and if there's not a whole lot of conflict between the business class and the labor class, then things are going to be easier for him. It's somewhat of a simplification, but Napoleon III did things like ordered the rebuilding of Paris, and you can see the Impressionist version of that in the center painting at the bottom, the broad avenues. Now, part of that was to assert greater military control over Paris, but another part of it was to provide jobs. These are public works types jobs. And so that's the government kind of funneling the resources here. You can see the 1908 Metro. You know, France had streetcars fairly early on. This is not to say there weren't problems between management and labor. And so in the top right, we have a reenactment of a novelized coal strike. And so in those kinds of situations, France's leadership, the same as the leadership in the United States and in Britain, often sided with the factory owners, because that was a stronger pillar of support. But Napoleon III creates certain financial structures that really jumpstart France's industrialization. He creates two national banks, one to loan money to investors in agriculture and one to loan money to the factory owners. And so that, he's kind of creating the atmosphere where this kind of business can take off. And so this is one of the things we see in Europe. It's unusual in Europe for industrialization to occur under a truly democratic government, or anything even approaching that. You know, Britain is an outlier in that regard, which it's a more representative government. It's much more typical for there to be some kind of autocratic or dictatorial element to the government while industrialization occurs. So I mentioned Romanticism. Romanticism was popular throughout, but much more popular in France prior to industrialization. As industrialization encouraged a mindset that Romanticism was too dreamy and unrealistic, idealistic and impractical. And so what comes out of industrialization is realism. And so in French realism, we see a real emphasis on literature, and especially novels. And so Émile Zola, who wrote Germinal, is one of the great French realists. And so what they're trying to do is, in a scientific way, use the evidence of the situation. And in the case of Germinal, Émile Zola carefully researched coal strikes in coal mining communities and the business classes before he put this together. And so it's like historical fiction today. It can often be as well researched as any kind of scholarly type of evaluation of a period. And so French realism is a really strong fit for industrialization, because it's using almost a scientific method to objectively portray events, but it's also trying to draw attention to some of the problems that come out of industrialization. And then we have Impressionism towards the end of the century. So the trend by then is to greater abstraction. And in the Impressionist painting that you see there, you can see the larger brushstrokes less attention being paid to detail. Part of this is a response to realism. Realism is too focused on this world, and it doesn't really convey, the Impressionists would say, the true meaning of a situation. Part of it is because of this greater exploration of the human mind, where people are trying to create art that gets to the psychological experience of something. And part of it then is kind of a feeling that art should play a different role than photography. And once the camera is invented, then why do you need to photorealistically portray things? So the realism and impressionism were strong artistic movements during the reign of Napoleon III. So this is an illustration of how strong the economy of France was, that there's something of a cultural rebirth during his reign. And he did not like Impressionism, and his wife basically said that it wasn't really art. But it's nevertheless, the movement really gets going during his reign. So what brings him down are his failed foreign policy escapades. And he was known as an astute diplomatic operator, as well as a good politician at home. And people who negotiated with him, even people like Bismarck, who we think of as being super clever, they respected Napoleon III and were alert to kind of his wiles when it came to diplomacy. But he nevertheless gets himself involved in a series of foreign policy disasters, mainly so that he can take attention away from some of the pressures he's facing domestically. So a great example of this is the war he gets involved in with Prussia in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. And there was no real good reason to get involved in that war. He just wanted to kind of flex his muscle and take attention away from the failures in some of the other foreign policy initiatives, and also to take attention away from the social question, from this question of how much welfare to provide to the working class. So he is defeated right away at the Battle of Sedan, and then Paris is forced to surrender by 1871. And that brings down Napoleon III's Second Empire, and we have the creation of the Third Republic. And so the Third Republic is going to last a long, long time, it really lasts through World War II, although by the time World War II starts, there's not really a Third Republic anymore. But the Third Republic is created in response to Napoleon III's reign. And so the Napoleon III, remember, had started as the president of the Second Republic. And so the framers of the Third Republic wanted to ensure that that kind of thing never happened again. And so they created a very weak executive and a very strong legislature. And so that's part of the reason for the shakiness of the government. Now let's look at a couple of things that happened during the Third Republic. As we would see in Britain at the same time, there is a much stronger push for women to get the right to vote. And Flora Tristan, who's kind of this polymath type figure, she's involved in all kinds of different things. It was one of the literary advocates for that right. And so the feeling that many people had at this point is that if women got rights like the right to vote, then it would make them masculine. And so this is one of those arguments that Flora Tristan is going to have to take on in order to convince people. So as in Britain, while the movement grows and it's stronger and she's bringing attention to the problem, it's not successful. And in France, there's going to be a much greater lag. France is a Catholic country, and so the French women don't get the right to vote until after World War II. This is the same is the case in Italy. So unlike Germany or Scandinavian states or Britain, which give the right to vote in the early 20th century, France takes a lot longer. The second big event of the Third Republic that's worth noting is the Dreyfus Affair. So this is when a Jewish army officer was framed for treason, accused of selling secrets to the Germans. It became clear early on that he was not selling secrets to the Germans. They were even able to identify after a short time the officer who was selling the secrets to the Germans, and nevertheless, Dreyfus was found guilty and sent to Devil's Island, the prison island. And so this becomes one of those cause célèbres of the day. It attracts all kinds of notable French figures and even figures outside of France. And so Émile Zola, the famous realist writer, writes an article, J'accuse, which publicizes what is happening here. And so the Dreyfus Affair illustrates a couple of different patterns. So one is the lack of support for the Third Republic among conservatives. The Catholic Church and the army were using the Dreyfus Affair essentially as a way to kind of flex their strength versus the Republic. It was an effort to win this argument as a way of weakening the hold of the Third Republic. And it backfires. The Third Republic is going to get the public opinion on its side, and is going to win out in this whole thing, which is going to enable it to take to remove the church from areas like marriage and education to an even greater degree than before, and to assert greater control over the military than would have been the case before. And the other element here is that the Dreyfus Affair reveals that anti-Semitism is strong even in a country like France that was considered to be among the most enlightened. So the feeling, even among many Jewish intellectuals by the time we got to the late 19th century, was that you didn't have to worry about anti-Semitism in France. France had granted emancipation to Jews, granted full rights. It was places like Russia where pogroms were breaking out where you had to worry about this. And so people are horrified when this happens because it shows the strength of anti-Semitism in Western Europe. And so the Zionism, Jewish nationalism, the desire for a Jewish state, gains strength as a result of the Dreyfus Affair. It's not successful until after World War II, the Zionist movement. But the accusations against this Jewish officer that are so clearly unfounded are going to strengthen this movement for the Jews to get their own state. So by the time we get to the end of the period, when we get up to 1914, then we have a Third Republic that has kind of reasserted itself in a way. It has won in the debate over the Dreyfus Affair, which enables it to reduce conservative influence in the military and in politics to a greater degree than before. And so this is going to put it in a fairly good position to fight the First World War. Now, the French Third Republic is also, not going to have that strong executive leadership to make some calls early on, and so they're to some degree or another on autopilot as they head into the war, and so the leadership of the Third Republic isn't all that strong during the First World War. It's going to shake its reputation, and then the Third Republic is going to do a poor job handling the Great Depression, which will shake its reputation. And then the Third Republic will do a pretty bad job of handling the Nazi threat, which destroys its reputation. And that's the end of the Third Republic. But it has a good run over that late industrial period.